What if there was a single, nameless force running quietly underneath every act of persuasion in human history? Underneath the sway a great orator holds over a crowd, the pull a serpent seems to hold over a frightened bird, and the strange calm certainty of a soldier who walks straight into a line of level muskets and somehow walks out alive. What if mesmerism, hypnotism, personal magnetism, and old-fashioned charm were never actually separate powers at all, but simply different faces of one and the same thing? Today we're opening a strange, fascinating little book from the very early 1900s that makes exactly that argument, and then tries to teach its readers how to recognize, resist, and responsibly use this force for themselves. The book is called Mental Fascination, written by William Walker Atkinson, and published in 1907. Atkinson was one of the most prolific writers to come out of the American New Thought movement, a man who wrote under his own name and under several pseudonyms, covering everything from willpower to yoga to what he called mental magic. This particular volume was actually published as a kind of companion piece, a sidelight manual meant to expand on a single lesson called Personal Influence from his larger work, The Secret of Mental Magic. Atkinson tells us plainly in his preface that he set out to condense a great deal of valuable information into this small book, and that he believed it was high time this powerful influence, for good or ill, should be studied, understood, and mastered openly, rather than left as a kind of secret weapon in the hands of the few. His own guiding philosophy comes through in one memorable line. Ignorance is no protection, he tells us, and the best way to dispel darkness is simply to turn on the light. So let's turn on that light together, starting exactly where Atkinson starts, with a basic question sitting at the center of this entire book. What exactly is mental fascination? Atkinson traces the word back to its Latin root, meaning to enchant, bewitch, or captivate, and he gathers up the dictionary definitions into a single idea: to influence the imagination, reason, or will of another in some uncontrollable, irresistible way. But then he offers his own broader definition, the one that will guide the rest of the book. Mental fascination, as he uses the term, is simply the action of mental force that powerfully influences the imagination, desire, or will of another person. And under this one umbrella, he tells us we can gather every variety of what people have historically called personal magnetism, hypnotism, mesmerism, charming, and so on, different names, he insists, for different phases of the very same underlying phenomenon. As for what this force actually is, Atkinson refers his readers back to his larger work, but gives us the short version here. Each individual mind, he tells us, is a center of what he calls mentative energy, part of one vast universal mentative energy filling all of existence. This energy can be transmitted from person to person through what he calls mentative currents or waves, which tend to induce, in the mind of whoever received them, the same feelings and emotions that existed in the mind of the person sending them out. And within this energy, he identifies two poles, which he calls the motive and the emotive. The motive pole manifests as willpower, which compels, drives, and commands. The emotive pole manifests as desire force, which draws, pulls, and attracts. Willpower, in his framing, is the masculine phase of this energy, and desire force the feminine, and the strongest instances of fascination, he tells us, always involve some combination of the two working together. Having laid out his basic theory, Atkinson turns next to a rather startling place to look for evidence of it, the animal kingdom. Even before humanity existed, he tells us, mental fascination was already at work among the lower forms of life. He points to the strange, instinctive attraction that seems to draw even living cells and atoms toward one another across distances that ordinary physical explanation struggles to account for. Among animals, this same force manifests along two lines: in the drawing together of mates during courtship, and in the paralyzing hold that certain predators seem to exert over their prey. He recounts, drawing on 19th century naturalists, several vivid stories. A professor crossing the Hudson River, who discovers a crowd of frightened, chirping birds circling helplessly around a large black snake, seemingly transfixed. A ground squirrel that, after a long and desperate struggle, finally gives up entirely and lays its head calmly beside the open jaws of a waiting rattlesnake. A traveler in Africa who watches a bird's convulsive trembling as a serpent's fiery eyes draw steadily closer, only to find a bird already dead from sheer terror by the time he manages to shoot the snake and rescue it. Atkinson even shares a small personal memory here, recalling a strange farmhand from his own boyhood in Maryland known locally as a snake charmer, a man who could hold poisonous snakes utterly transfixed before scooping them up barehanded, and whose quiet company of pet snakes the local farm workers regarded with genuine, superstitious dread. And Atkinson himself recalls a brief, vivid childhood encounter of his own with a small snake, whose glittering eyes momentarily swallowed his entire field of vision before the creature simply glided away. His point in gathering all these stories together is a simple one. Whether we're looking at the courtship dance of birds, the paralyzing stare of a serpent, or the sway a great orator holds over a hostile crowd, we are looking, Atkinson insists, at exactly the same underlying force, merely expressed along different lines as life itself grows more complex. From these animal instincts, Atkinson widens his lens to trace the story of mental fascination straight through recorded human history. He describes how the strong-willed among early tribal peoples instinctively learned to dominate their weaker-willed companions long before anyone understood the underlying principle at work. He describes the rise of the priestly caste across ancient civilizations, figures who, freed from the daily grind of hunting or farming, had the rare luxury of time to think, and who gradually built up a deep, closely guarded knowledge of these mental forces, reinforcing their own authority in the process. He traces the old legend behind our very word magnet, explaining how the ancient magi, the wise men of Persia, were so renowned for their mental powers that when the attractive pull of the lodestone was first observed, people naturally likened it to Magian power, giving us both the words magnet and magic centuries later. He offers us a wonderful gallery of historical figures to illustrate the force at work. Julius Caesar, still a young man, taken prisoner by pirates near Rhodes, yet somehow commanding those very pirates as though he were their ruler rather than their captive, right down to calmly promising, and later delivering, their execution once he regained his freedom. Alcibiades the Athenian, who wagered he could publicly humiliate a respected elder and still walk away with that same man's daughter in marriage, and did exactly that through sheer audacious charm. And most vividly of all, Napoleon returning from exile on Elba, walking calmly on foot straight toward a line of royalist soldiers with their muskets already leveled at his chest, gazing steadily into their eyes as the order to fire rang out, and watching those same soldiers throw down their weapons and rush toward him shouting for their emperor instead. Atkinson brings the story right up to his own era too, mentioning the famous magnetism of the politician James Blaine, the electrifying effect of William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech on an unprepared political convention, and the preacher Henry Ward Beecher, who once faced down an entire hostile audience in England to the sheer, unrelenting force of his gaze and will, gradually silencing their jeers until they sat listening to him for 2 full hours. From these historical flashes, Atkinson turns to a more formal, scientific history of the subject, beginning with Franz Anton Mesmer himself, who proposed the existence of mysterious universal fluid he called animal magnetism, flowing between bodies and producing all manner of striking effects, and who was alternately celebrated and condemned for it. He walks us through the successive theories that followed. The Abbé Faria, who argued the resulting sleep state actually arose from within the patient rather than from any outside fluid. James Braid, the surgeon who coined the very word hypnotism and attributed the whole phenomenon to simple physical fatigue of the eyes and muscles. And finally, the French school of Leibold and Bernheim, who located the real cause in simple verbal suggestion given during deep sleep. Atkinson's own verdict on this whole tangled history is that every one of these theorists stumbled onto real, genuine effects, but each one then built an overly narrow theory around his own particular method, mistaking one visible mechanism for the whole underlying truth. What was actually needed, he argues, was a new synthesis capable of reconciling all of these seemingly contradictory schools of thought into one coherent, unified principle. And it's exactly this reconciliation that Atkinson sets out to provide in his next chapter. He walks back through each competing theory in turn and shows how his own idea of mentative energy and mentative induction quietly absorbs and explains every one of them. Mesmer's mysterious fluid, Atkinson argues, was never truly a physical substance at all, simply an early, understandably physical era's best attempt at naming a genuinely mental force. Faria's insistence that sleep arose from within the patient himself was correct as far as it went, but that inner sleep, Atkinson explains, was still being actively induced by the waves of mentative energy pouring outward from the operator. Braid's emphasis on tired eyes and rigid muscles similarly captured a real, secondary mechanism, since the fatigue will genuinely does become more susceptible to outside suggestion. But Braid had mistaken this softening of resistance for the actual underlying cause, and the suggestionists, who credited everything to mere verbal command, Atkinson challenges with one pointed question. Why do the very same words, spoken in the very same tone by two entirely different people, so often produce wildly different results? His answer is that the words themselves were never really doing the work. The genuine feeling and mentative energy standing behind those words was doing it all along. Having laid this reconciling foundation, Atkinson turns to what he calls the actual rationale of fascination, the specific mechanics of how one mind actually comes to influence another. He walks us carefully through a typical case of mesmerism. The operator assumes what he calls a positive mental state, concentrating his will, while the subject assumes a corresponding negative state, opening his desire to the operator's influence while allowing his own will to remain passive and relaxed. Atkinson is careful to stress that there is no physical compulsion happening here at all. It's entirely a matter of mentation, two minds silently negotiating a kind of temporary hierarchy, a subtle contest that Atkinson insists actually occurs in smaller and less obvious ways every single time any two people happen to meet. Since the constant emphasis throughout this book falls on that essential difference between positive and negative mental states, Atkinson devotes a full chapter next to exploring exactly what makes some people naturally more impressionable to outside influence than others. At one extreme sit the strong-willed natural leaders, people whose settled confidence and inner poise make them remarkably resistant to outside suggestion. At the other extreme sit those Atkinson calls impressionables, People who tend to reflect back whatever thought or mood happens to be nearest them at any given moment, rather like a weather vane turning with every passing breeze. Interestingly, Atkinson notes that people are genuinely strong, highly developed imagination, actors, poets, and artists sometimes appear impressionable in public demonstrations. But this, he explains, is really a case of these imaginative people essentially hypnotizing themselves to their own vivid, willing engagement with the performance, rather than truly submitting their will to someone else's. He offers a helpful list here of the qualities that tend to make a person naturally capable of exerting real fascination over others. Genuine physical vitality, a settled, confident belief in one's own ability, calm, unshakable poise, real fearlessness, the capacity for focused, single-pointed concentration, and a fixed, unwavering sense of purpose. And he's careful to debunk a few popular myths along the way, noting that impressionability has nothing meaningfully to do with hair color or gender, and firmly correcting the common but mistaken claim that only weak-minded people can be mesmerized. The real determining factor, he insists, isn't intelligence at all, but simply the relative development or underdevelopment of a person's own will. To bring this whole dynamic vividly to life, Atkinson offers us something rather unexpected next, a small allegorical fable. He introduces us to a happily married couple named Volos and Emotion, living together in a place he calls Mentalvania. Volos represents the will, strong, steady, and determined, but rather literal-minded and unimaginative on his own. Emotion represents desire, emotion, and imagination, wonderfully intuitive and creative, but easily swayed and impressionable when left entirely to herself. Together, Atkinson tells us, they form a wonderfully productive partnership, emotion dreaming up bold visions that Volos then goes out and makes real. But trouble arrives the moment Volos leaves the castle unguarded. A charming, fascinating stranger begins slipping past the gate whenever Volos is absent or distracted, or simply worn down by exhausting argument, and talks poor emotion into one extravagant, foolish purchase after another. Eventually a wise man is called in to settle the resulting domestic chaos, and his diagnosis captures the whole moral of the story perfectly. Volos without emotion has no genuine desire or imagination to act on at all. Emotion without Volos becomes nothing but an unrestrained, easily exploited fire of impulse. Together, properly united, they're invincible. Separated, each one becomes vulnerable to exactly the kind of fascinating stranger who slipped past the gate. And Atkinson's larger point lands exactly where you'd expect it to. Every single one of us carries our own inner Volos and emotion, our own will, and our own desire. And whenever we let our attention wander, or let our grow tired and distracted, we leave our own inner castle gate wide open for exactly this kind of fascinating stranger to slip through. If you're finding this strange journey through old-fashioned psychology genuinely interesting so far, take a moment to subscribe now, because we're about to move into far more hands-on, experimental heart of this book, where Atkinson actually walks us through the laboratory methods used to study and demonstrate this force directly. Atkinson describes in real practical detail the kind of quiet, softly lit, comfortably furnished room favored by serious experimenters of his day, and the careful, gentle process of testing a person's basic impressionability, often started with a simple exercise where a raised finger is suggested to feel a faint, gradually spreading tingling sensation. From there, he walks us through a whole sequence of classic muscular tests still recognizable today. The falling forward and falling backward tests, where a relaxed subject is gently talked into swaying toward or away from the experimenter. The fasten palm test, where a subject becomes convinced they simply cannot lift their hand away from the experimenter's own. The locked fingers and clenched fist tests, where a subject becomes equally convinced they cannot pull their own interlocked hands apart. And variations involving canes, chairs, and even a person's own spoken name. Atkinson is emphatic, again and again, that none of this genuinely requires any actual sleep state at all, contrary to the popular belief of his time. And he's equally emphatic about one crucial piece of practical advice, one he repeats so often becomes something of a refrain throughout the book. Always remove the impression afterward, gently reassuring the subject that everything is now, as he puts it, all right, so that no lingering suggestion accidentally follows them back out into their ordinary day. From these purely muscular demonstrations, Atkinson moves next into the equally striking territory of induced sensation. He describes the well-known burning hand test, where a subject's hand, merely touched lightly and told repeatedly that it's growing hot, actually begins to genuinely feel warm, sometimes uncomfortably so. He describes similarly induced sensations of pain, smell, sight, hearing, and taste, offering vivid real-world examples, like an entire theater audience convincing themselves they can smell magnolias or leaking gas, purely because a play's dialogue or staged action planted the powerful suggestion in their minds. He even describes his own past success using vivid, repeated suggestion to help people break the habit of chewing tobacco or smoking cigarettes, simply by attaching a deep, genuine sense of disgust to the taste itself. Perhaps most striking of all, he describes a deliberate inhibition of pain through pure mental suggestion, sometimes strong enough to allow minor dental work or small procedures to be performed with remarkably little discomfort, achieved simply by directing a subject's attention calmly and repeatedly away from the affected area, gently talking a limb into a state of complete comfortable numbness. From these fairly straightforward sensory experiments, Atkinson moves into what he considers the truly higher phenomena of the whole subject, the realm of induced imagination itself. He draws a careful distinction here between what he calls positive imagination, the creative, deliberate faculty behind every genuine invention, work of art, or original idea, and its more passive shadow, which he simply calls fancy or negative imagination, the kind of drifting, susceptible daydream state that responds easily to outside suggestion rather than generating its own original direction. The classic hypnotic subject, he explains, is really someone in whom this negative fancy has been temporarily set into motion, not by their own will, but by the concentrated will and vivid suggestion of the operator standing in front of them. He introduces a memorable term here for describing a very particular kind of subject, the hyper-impressionable, a person combining an unusually passive will with an unusually vivid imaginative fancy, making them the genuinely ideal subject for more dramatic public demonstrations of stage hypnotism. And he's admirably candid about the actual mechanics of professional hypnotic show itself, describing how a handful of paid performers, whom he calls horses, get things started by rushing eagerly to the stage first, encouraging the genuinely impressionable members of the audience to follow their lead through simple imitation, and how subjects who fail the easier preliminary tests are quietly sent back to their seats, leaving only the most cooperative, most genuinely susceptible participants remaining for the more sensational parts of the show. He offers a wonderfully simple, almost childlike illustration to describe the strange, half-real mental state these genuine hypnotic subjects actually experience. It's rather like children playing at being frightened of a friend dressed up as a bear, he says. They know perfectly well it's only their friend underneath the costume. And yet, in some very real sense, they're still genuinely a little bit scared anyway. Atkinson then turns to a subject he clearly feels rather strongly about and wants his readers to understand with real seriousness: the genuine dangers hiding inside certain deeper trance practices. He draws a sharp line here between what he considers wholesome, constructive uses of these mental principles, and something he calls psychism, a family of self-induced or hypnotist-induced trance states, achieved through methods like staring fixedly at a bright object, or the tip of one's own nose, or repeating some droning, monotonous chant. These deeper trance states, Atkinson warns quite bluntly, are not a sign of spiritual advancement at all, whatever fashionable claims might surround them at the time. They are, in his own memorable phrase, awakening practices, achieved essentially by exhausting a person's will through unusual sensory strain until it simply goes passive and undefended. He offers his readers one simple, practical test to apply to any new practice or teacher they encounter. Does this make me strong? If the honest answer is no, Atkinson says, walk away from entirely. From this serious warning, Atkinson turns to a genuinely delightful chapter exploring some of the most dramatic feats attributed to the magicians of the Orient, particularly of India and Persia. He recounts, through the testimony of skeptical Western travelers who witnessed these performances firsthand, several truly astonishing demonstrations. A magician who appears to grow tiny snakes into enormous serpents through nothing but a droning chant, then shrinks them back down to nothing again. A young assistant who appears to spin, rise, and vanish entirely into the open sky, only to reappear moments later descending gently back to earth. A mango seed that seems to sprout, grow, flower, and bear ripe fruit within mere minutes, right there in the sand. And most famous of all, the legendary rope trick, where a knotted rope appears to climb into the air entirely on its own, followed by an assistant who climbs it and vanishes from sight. Here's a genuinely fascinating twist, though. Atkinson tells us that when curious observers actually tried photographing these demonstrations, the resulting pictures showed absolutely nothing unusual at all. Simply a magician sitting calmly to one side, quietly amused, with no rope, no assistant, and no floating serpent anywhere in the frame. These astonishing feats, in other words, were never physically happening at all. They were remarkably powerful, collectively shared mental illusions, induced directly in the minds of the assembled crowd through extraordinarily well-developed concentration and visualization. The very same underlying force covered throughout this entire book, simply cultivated to an extraordinarily advanced degree through years of patient, disciplined practice. From these dramatic Oriental demonstrations, Atkinson brings us back to something considerably more subtle and useful in ordinary daily life, the phenomenon he calls future impression. This is essentially what later psychologists would call post-hypnotic suggestion, the planning of an instruction that only actually activates at some specified point in the future, whether minutes, hours, or even days later. But Atkinson is quick to point out that this same basic principle quietly operates all through our ordinary, everyday conversations too. Whenever someone casually tells a young bride she'll surely grow tired of her husband eventually, or tells a new employee that the novelty of their job will surely wear off before long, these offhand remarks, Atkinson warns, can function as small, delayed seeds planted directly in the listener's mind, sometimes quietly working to make themselves come true later on. His suggested antidote is refreshingly simple and direct. The moment you sense an unwelcome suggestion, whether aimed at your present moment or planned for your future, meet it immediately with a firm, decisive, silent declaration. No, I won't. Having covered how this force can be used on us, Atkinson devotes the remainder of the book to how we might deliberately, responsibly cultivate and use this same force for ourselves. He asks his readers to picture themselves as a genuine center of mentative energy floating within one vast, universal ocean of mental power, and offers a series of visualization exercises meant to make this abstract idea feel genuinely real and immediate. He introduces a phrase meant to function almost like a personal mantra, a settled statement of inner strength readers can return to whenever they need it. I am a living electromagnet, combining in one single image both the pulling, attracting quality of desire, likened here to magnetism, and the pushing, driving quality of will, likened to electricity. From this inner foundation, Atkinson moves outward to discuss what he calls personal atmosphere, the felt quality that seems to surround certain confident individuals wherever they go. He shares two small, charming real-world examples here. A woman in Chicago who kept complaining that crowds on the busy sidewalks were constantly jostling and shoving her until she deliberately built up, in her own mind, a settled statement asserting that people respected her space, at which point the constant jostling simply stopped. And another woman who felt persistently ignored and poorly treated by department store clerks, until she likewise built up a settled mental picture of being genuinely liked and valued, after which the very same clerks began treating her with noticeably more warmth and attention. From this broader personal atmosphere, Atkinson narrows his focus to what he calls direct personal influence, the actual tools we use, consciously or not, whenever we interact with another person face to face. He identifies three main instruments here: the suggestive manner, meaning the simple confidence or hesitation carried in our posture and bearing; the suggestive tone, meaning the genuine feeling carried in our voice, rather than mere hollow mechanical politeness; and the suggestive word itself, since Atkinson memorably describes every single word as a small crystallized thought, carrying real emotional weight depending on how deliberately and feelingly it happens to be chosen and spoken. He then turns to what might be the single most striking chapter in the whole book, an extended, quite technical discussion of the eyes themselves as instruments of influence. He walks readers through a series of careful eyelid positioning exercises meant to be practiced in front of a mirror, describing exactly how the position of the upper eyelid relative to the iris and pupil shifts the whole expression of a face between calmness, indifference, strong interest, deep thought, emotional activity, and full emotional excitement. And he introduces what he calls a fascinating gaze, offering a specific, almost technical correction to the popular advice of his day. Rather than staring directly into another person's eyes, which tend to strain your own eyes and appear rather cross and unnatural, Atkinson recommends softly, deliberately focusing your gaze slightly beyond the other person entirely, as though gazing calmly through them towards some distant point. The very same soft, unfocused gaze we naturally use when lost in a daydream. Done properly, he tells us, this creates an impression of deep, penetrating, effortless intensity in the other person's eyes, while actually costing you far less strain and fatigue than an ordinary close, direct stare ever would. Rounding out his discussion of these practical instruments, Atkinson turns finally to the sense of touch itself, describing what he calls a magnetic hand clasp, an ordinary handshake deliberately infused with genuine warmth and feeling rather than performed as an empty, mechanical gesture. And here Atkinson pauses to offer some genuinely thoughtful, careful cautions, particularly directed at young women of his era, warning against allowing overly familiar physical contact from near strangers, precisely because touch, as he's just spent an entire chapter explaining, carries real psychological weight and influence, whether either party fully realizes it or not. Throughout these final chapters, Atkinson keeps circling back to what he considers the single most valuable piece of practical protection in the entire book, a tool he simply calls a positive denial. Whenever you sense someone attempting to influence you against your own genuine interests, whether through a lingering gaze, a persistent suggestion, or an overly familiar touch, Atkinson tells us you could dissolve that influence completely with a firm, silent, inward declaration. I deny your power over me. This single tool, he insists, functions like a kind of invisible armor, available to absolutely anyone the moment they genuinely understand and claim it for themselves. Atkinson brings the whole book to a close by widening his final lens one last time, touching briefly on the idea that the same influence can even be deliberately, silently directed at someone from a genuine physical distance, simply by holding a clear, vivid mental picture of that person and addressing them internally exactly as you would in person. But his very last words circle back, fittingly, to protection and personal sovereignty rather than influence over others at all. He offers his readers a handful of settled, grounding affirmations to fall back on whenever they sense any kind of unwanted mental pressure, closing with what he calls a statement of individuality. 3 quiet, unshakable words meant to anchor a person absolutely, wherever they happen to be, and whatever moment they happen to find themselves in. I am here now. So here we are at the end of William Walker Atkinson's mental fascination. Strip away the antique language and the confident turn of the century certainty, and what's actually left underneath is something genuinely worth sitting with. That real influence, the kind that moves crowds, wins arguments, and quietly shapes the outcome of an ordinary conversation, was never really about tricks or fluids or mysterious powers at all. It was always about presence, genuine feeling, settled confidence, and the simple, teachable difference between a mind that's actively directing its own attention and a mind that's merely drifting along wherever the nearest strong voice happens to lead it. Build your own settled center. Guard your own attention. And when you send someone else try and do your thinking for you, remember Atkinson's simple, sturdy little answer. No, I won't. If this strange journey through the old psychology of influence and fascination has been worth your time, go ahead and subscribe now, so you'll be here for whatever curious, half-forgotten book we open together next. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Until next time, stay grounded, stay genuinely yourself, and keep your own gate well guarded.